Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the BECO Go-To events. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rebecca Shrum, Director of Workplace Experiences for BECO. And we're so proud to have Dr. Jeff Gilman with us from UNC Charlotte. And of course, he's going to tell us all about our yards, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and how we can fix it. For those of you who have sent your questions already, Jeff has those questions and he'll be sure to hit those. Just keep in mind there's a lot of geographic area to cover between Chicago, Charlotte, and the DC metro area, so he'll do his best to answer your questions. If you have anything else additional you'd like us to cover, you're welcome to type your questions into the chat and I'll make sure that he hears those questions. But he's going to start off for about 10 or 15 minutes uninterrupted with his presentation so that we can hear the important part of it, and then he'll hit those questions that he already has. So without any further ado, Jeff, we'll have you go ahead and start with your lecture. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today talking with you all. I do typically love to have questions while I'm talking, but since I have so many of your questions already, I thought that it might make sense this time to get about 10 or 15 minutes of lecture in before we start going to questions and stuff, and then I'm looking forward to an entertaining back and forth it always is. So one of the interesting things to me when I got all the questions was that they were probably three quarters of them were about the lawn. And that really is what people are interested in. So I am going to spend a great deal of this lecture on fall lawn care, but also lawn care in general. Before I do, though, I want to talk a little bit about the fall in general and what's going on. So fall is a time when you look out and you see these beautiful trees with their leaves turning yellow and red, and it's just fantastic. Then the leaves drop and you go into the winter. I want you to think about this for a second because this is actually quite important. What is happening to the trees as they are going into the winter? They are actually, the leaves are actually turning red and yellow because the plant is pulling nutrients from the leaves in preparation for dropping. When the leaves drop, the tree no longer has a way to pull water up its stem, okay? This is a very important concept. The stem of the tree is actually a whole bunch of little tiny straws all together. The leaves actually have tiny pores in them, tiny holes in them, where water comes out and evaporates. The evaporation of the water from the leaves actually draws water up the stem, up those little straws. Once the leaves are lost, the tree no longer has a way to pull water up into itself. The tree needs to go into the winter with a decent amount of water in its stem. Otherwise, you're going to have dieback over the winter. This isn't just true of trees. I'm using trees because, you know, it just kind of makes sense to talk about trees. But it's true for shrubs. This is true for evergreens. So we are starting to go into the winter. No matter where you are, no matter whether you're in Charlotte or Chicago, we are getting ready to go into the winter now. Your trees that are still green, they need to be well watered now. Once they lose their leaves, it barely matters anymore. All right, the next thing that happens in the fall, and by fall I mean fall going into winter. Plants grow roots. Now, for you in Chicago, and I lived in Minnesota for 15 years, was at the University of Minnesota, and I actually worked with tree roots. That was my specialty, the growth of tree roots, CFP. Here's the thing. Tree roots never stop growing. The top of the tree goes dormant. The top of the shrub goes dormant. The bottom of the tree never goes dormant. Now, when you have a freeze 40 inches down, the tree roots can't grow, but it's not because they're dormant, it's because they can't go through frozen ground. The thing is, they are still alive and have the ability to grow once the ground thaws out. So actually, planting in the fall, planting trees, planting shrubs in the fall is the best time to plant. In fact, planting grass in the fall is the best time to plant, because you will get root growth without getting top growth. What that means is that by planting now, you're going to have trees and shrubs working their roots into the ground and establishing themselves so that next spring they can have a whole bunch of top growth, okay? So keep that in mind, that this is the season to plant seeds. This is the season to plant trees. This is the season to plant all kinds of things. If you're into dividing perennials, here in Charlotte, we're almost to the dividing season. Up in Chicago, you're pretty much on top of dividing season, or at least in the next week or two, it's dividing season. And for those of you who don't know what dividing is, it's basically taking a shovel where you have a perennial that's spreading out, take a shovel and you split up whatever plant you have into a few different sections and plant it in different places around the house. Again, fall is the time to plant. The garden centers get all the action in the spring. Let me tell you something. The spring is not the time for action at the garden center. The fall is the time for action, okay? Keep that in mind. People just don't realize it. Fall is the time to plant. All right, now I want to shift over into grass specifically. And I had so many questions on grass, and I want to start off by saying grass is terrible. Grass is awful. What are you thinking? Okay, we're done now. The grass that we plant here in the United States is divided into two groups. Warm season grasses that grow in the southern states, and cool season grasses that grow primarily in the northern states. Charlotte is the cutoff between the two. And some people say, well, that means you can grow either warm season or cool season. That's not what I say. What I say is, Charlotte, you can fail with cool season and you can fail with warm season. Grass, generally speaking, does very poorly in Charlotte because we're not quite warm enough for the warm season and we're not quite cool enough for the cool season grasses. So growing grass here in Charlotte is very, very difficult. The next thing that I want to say about grasses, and in fact, you know, in the questions y'all sent me, I had a couple of questions, and I was excited to see this about native plants. And I do want to say that I'm not a native plant, you know, crazy person. I do like native plants, but I like introduced plants at all. I like all the different types of plants, but there's something to be said for planting at least some native plants. When you think of a turf grass, whatever turf grass you're thinking of, it's not native. And you're thinking to yourself right now, you're thinking Kentucky bluegrass. No, Kentucky bluegrass is European. Maybe you're thinking tall fescue, European, Asian. Fine fescue, European, Asian. All of these grasses, with a very, very few exceptions, these are introduced plants, not meant for our climate. I had a number of you ask, how do you make grass that looks like it's standing up straight, that's bright green and very dense? When you see a lawn like that, it's actually pretty similar to one of these really huge bodybuilders that takes a lot of steroids and stuff. It's actually extremely difficult to get a grass to look like that. And when we do get grass looking like that, typically it uses more poisons than you would want to use. In fact, the biggest users of pesticides in the United States are golf courses to get their grass to look like that. Okay, I've just said all the mean stuff about grass. Now let me tell you some history of grass, and then we'll get into how to actually make it work. Okay, so grass has been grown for lawns since the early 1900s. In fact, even a little bit before that. And we used to have what we called rolled lawns. Rolled lawns, basically just lawns where you roll them kind of flat. Now, of course, we cut our lawns. Once upon a time, lawns had built-in fertilizer. Let me explain what I mean by having a built-in fertilizer. When you planted a lawn, you would plant clover in it. I know, you're thinking, clover is a weed. No, clover is not a weed. Until the 1950s, grass seed always had clover included in it. Why did grass seed have clover included in it? Because clover is a legume. Legumes take nitrogen from the air. And then when you cut clover, it actually goes into the soil and enriches the soil, actually fertilizes the soil. So having clover in your lawn was actually considered a valuable thing. So why don't we have clover in the lawn anymore? Well, we don't have clover in the lawn anymore because in World War II, we came up with a pesticide called 2,4-D. 2,4-D kills broadleaf weeds, things like dandelions, without touching grasses, okay? So it absolutely wastes things like dandelions and plantains, if you know what that is, without touching grasses. So it was great for lawns, but it also killed clover. So because it killed clover, we decided not to have clover in our lawns anymore. So now we don't have clover in our lawns anymore, and we no longer have a built-in fertilizer for our lawns. So starting in the 1950s, we had to start using synthetic fertilizers for our lawns instead of having that built-in fertilizer. So lawns are actually pretty tough. And because of the way we grow them, we now have to fertilize them, and we have to hit them with herbicides, and they've grown into a very difficult thing to control. With that said, now I want to talk to you a little bit about what you do to keep your lawn looking its best. Okay? So the first thing to keep a lawn looking its best is to plant grasses that are going to look good for your area. I can't really tell you what lawns are going to look good in your area. It actually differs place to place in the United States. But it also differs, even within Charlotte here, there are different grasses that will look good in different areas. What I encourage you to do is to talk to your state extension service. They can help out. If you are in the northern part of the United States, if you're in the Maryland area, if you're in the Chicago area, you are probably going to want to look for either a Kentucky bluegrass or a type of fescue. But the specific type of Kentucky bluegrass and the specific type of fescue is going to be particular to your area. A number of you asked about shaded spots. For shady grass spots, probably the best thing that you need to look for is a tall fescue. Tall fescues generally do well in shade, okay? The time to plant these grasses is, no matter where you are in the U.S., pretty much right about now, or at least over the next month. Last year, I actually planted in January. Here in Charlotte, we can do that. But the idea with planting now is that the grass's roots will grow down, and they'll get established. And then when next spring rolls around, bam, they're ready to go. Up there in Chicago, what's going to happen is that your plants are going to have a chance to put down the root system. The ground's going to freeze, no big deal. After the plant comes out freezing, then they're ready to go again. Up there in Chicago, if you plant during January, again, like I did last January, the seeds they're not going to die, actually, but they're never going to really get a chance to get going. And the runoff from the snow is going to mean that your grass seed is going to move around a whole lot and really not be where you want it, okay? I had a number of people asking about moss. Okay, so if you have moss, it probably means that you have a relatively shady area. But I want you to remember this about moss. Moss is growing because the site where it's growing is right for moss, okay? That's important. The site's right for moss. I don't think moss looks bad. There's nothing wrong with having part of your lawn in moss. I know that you don't like it. Just wanted to make the point that moss is growing there because it can grow there because it's healthy there. I have part of my lawn as moss, and I leave it. But I understand if you want to change it. If you want to change it, what you need to do is rototill that area and then plant something that is going to do well there. If it is a shady location, you probably want to go with tall fescue. Now, let me tell you something else about grass seed. You get what you pay for. So if you just buy a cheap sunshade mix, you're going to get something that looks good for a very, very brief period of time and then goes all to heck. It's going to have a lot of what's known as rye in it, R-Y-E, rye. Rye is a cheap grass. It fills in fast, but it will not give you a lasting turf. Shade mix is usually tall fescue, and it's usually quite expensive, And you know what? It's worth it. You get what you pay for in grass. So understand that. And again, before purchasing the grass, I really do recommend seeing what your extension service, what grasses your extension service recommends. All right, now I just told you about seeding in the lawn, and I told you a little bit about moss. Now I want to talk to you just a little bit about fertilizing, and then I want to talk about weed control. If you are fertilizing your grass, you should not fertilize right on top of planting. You should let the grass get established before fertilizing. So what that means is that if you are planting grass seed now, then fertilize in the spring. On the other hand, if you want to actually put fertilizer down but you aren't seeding, you can fertilize now. Now is a great time to fertilize going into the winter. Okay, great time to fertilize. The plants will take up the nutrients over the winter, then they'll start off the spring really strong. In fact, you probably wouldn't need an early spring fertilizer if you hit them now with fertility. Okay? All right, now, next point I want to make is that, and this is a big one, this is the season to control weeds in your lawn, like big time. This is the time to do it. Why is it the time to do it? Because if you hurt the weeds now, then they won't be able to make it through the winter. So now's the time to hit them. Make them weak now so that in the winter they won't be able to survive. What compounds should you use to hurt the grass? The compound that you're going to want to use to hurt the grass, the primary one, is 2,4-D. 2,4-D is the compound that I was talking about before that was discovered during World War II. And 2,4-D is going to do a great job with most of your broadleaf weeds. Now, that 2,4-D is also going to be in combination with some other chemicals, most commonly MECOPROP or MCPA. MECOPROP, MCPA basically do the same thing as 2,4-D, very effective chemicals. Here is what I want you to understand, though, about 2,4-D. 2,4-D is relatively safe. It's a pesticide, so I'm not calling it safe. I'm saying on a big scale of, really dangerous to, you can eat it, it's here. All pesticides should be considered here. Some pesticides are all the way over here. So don't consider it not dangerous. Let's say that somebody splashed some 2,4-D into your whiskey one night. Not a big deal. I'm not saying it's safe, but what would happen is that you'd pee it out. You'd pee it out within 24 hours. Humans process 2,4-D very rapidly. Now let's say that somebody took that 2,4-D and put it into your dog's bowl. The dog wouldn't pass it for a month or two. Well, 2,4-D is relatively safe for you and I because we are able to process it so rapidly. Dogs cannot process it rapidly, and it has been implicated in cancer for dogs. This whole thing where once it dries it's safe is not true, okay? Just flat. Just because it's dry, it's not true. 2,4-D lasts on your lawn for at least 2 weeks. If you've had a lawn application to control weeds, you've almost certainly had 2,4-D applied, and you should not be allowing your dog to walk through it for about 2 weeks if you can avoid it. And you might be saying, well, what about you? How often do you use 2,4-D? So my lawn does not look wonderful. I'll admit that right off the bat. I feel safe using 2,4-D about once every 2 years. That's all that I use this compound. I do not consider it safe because of the animals, not because of me, but because of its danger to animals. A number of you asked about crabgrass, and 'tis the season to think about crabgrass because we're about to go into the winter. Now, for those of you complaining about crabgrass, what I've got to say to you is, crabgrass is wonderful. Do you know that the United States Patent Office brought crabgrass to the United States in, I think it was 1846, as an emergency grain? You can actually make bread out of crabgrass. And if you have, starving cows, this is what you can feed your starving cow. No, I'm serious. The Patent Office actually brought crabgrass to the United States as an emergency grain, and it can be used that way. So you should love your crabgrass. All right, I'm kidding. What do you do about crabgrass? So crabgrass in every place, Maryland, Chicago, here in Charlotte. crabgrass is an annual. That means it only lives until the end of the season. What that means is you need to control it early in the season to stop it from growing through the season. What that means is that you need a pre-emergence herbicide. So you need to get a crabgrass preventer. When do you apply this crabgrass preventer? It can be applied now, and it can also be applied in the early spring. Either time is absolutely fine. I prefer my application in the early spring. That's when I personally will use it. Do I use it once a year? When I remember, I do use it once a year. I have a slight enough crabgrass problem that I usually catch it early, and I usually use this herbicide right here, which is my absolute favorite herbicide to get rid of my crabgrass. It typically takes me on a quarter-acre plot, typically takes me a couple of hours if I do it early in the season. So, you know, on the one hand, I'm a little bit lucky, but on the other hand, if you get it early, it is possible to control it by hand. And when I say I use my hand, I also have a little bit of a knife, so I dig out some of the roots. If you don't dig out the roots, it can be a problem. I do want to point out, some of you are going to be interested in using a weed and feed. You know, your fertilizer is going to have weed and feed in it. The active ingredient, again, is that 2,4-D that I talked about from World War II. The big problem with weed and feed is that coverage of your ground isn't very good. So weed and feed isn't a terrible herbicide, but it's actually not that great either. And I'm not a huge fan of weed and feed. I've used it in the past. I'm only so-so on it. The crabgrass preventer with fertilizer I like a lot more. The weed and feed, which has the 2,4-D, I'm not as high on. All right. With that said, do we have any questions coming in that I could address now? Other than that, I can talk about planting trees. Or you have some questions?
Yes, we do. So we've got a question about not grass, but tree care. And is it okay for the roots of the tree to start coming above ground? And then the other question in that same one is, how often should the arborist come to assess the trees and take a look for trimming?
Okay, you're going to have to read those to me again. The one with roots above ground, I'll be happy to address first. Okay, so what about a tree with roots above ground? Hold on just a sec. Tree. So let me talk a little bit about roots growing above the ground. First of all, when you plant the tree, it's good if you can see the main order roots at the surface. This plant's actually planted too deeply. I'm taking away all this topsoil so that when I plant this plant, I can actually see the uppermost roots. There. Now I can see the uppermost roots. Now it's appropriate to plant it. These should be at the soil surface, okay? So seeing the roots at the tree's base, around the tree, that's actually good. You want to see those roots. Now, there are, of course, exceptions. If you're next to a sidewalk and you have a tree that is continually putting roots up, you know, through the sidewalk and lifting the sidewalk, good chance you've got a silver maple. They just do that. But there are certain trees that just grow their roots near the surface of the soil. These trees are just tough to deal with, and honestly, before you plant a tree near a sidewalk, you should see what its propensity is for growing roots near the surface of the soil. But again, near the base of the tree, near the trunk of the tree, you want to see the roots going into the soil. What you don't want is a telephone pole going into the soil. If you have a telephone pole going into the soil with no root flare, what that actually means is that you're going to have roots growing up and crossing, and it's going to cause a lot more problems. So when you can, plant with that root flare visible. All right. Now, I believe the next question was about arborists. Is that correct? And how often arborists should come out to assess?
That's the correct question, yes.
Okay. When you've just purchased a house, I would recommend immediately having an arborist out to identify potential hazard trees. we have people walking through the gardens almost daily, assessing trees. I go out almost once a week. People are killed from falling limbs a lot more than you think they have. Just a few years ago, somebody at Chapel Hill, UNC Chapel Hill, was killed from a falling limb. Hazard trees are no joke. Having said that, for the typical homeowner, once you have that initial assessment, I would say that having an arborist out every 3 to 4 years is absolutely fine. I would also say that if you have an arborist out and they're all hot to trot about removing a tree, I'd have a second one. I'd have a second one come out and check. It's just good to get a second opinion, just like you would for a doctor. It's a good thing to get a second opinion with arborists. So that's about how I do it. But with a new property, absolutely. And if you've just built a new house, it's actually a big deal. A lot of builders will build new houses right next to existing trees and think, oh, look at this. Isn't this wonderful? Now it has this shade from this old tree. The problem is you probably cut a whole bunch of tree roots, which may be okay, and it may not be okay. And when it's not okay, it can go south really, really fast. You have no idea. Some of these old trees cannot take that kind of a root pruning, and within 5 years, you may be looking at a limb falling on your roof. So especially if you've just built a new house, you should get an arborist out right away. And again, after that, every 3-4 years, something like that. All right. Any more questions?
We got a couple more questions that came through while you were talking. One's about microclover, and if you've had any experience with the microclover, what does it say? Will be affected by broadleaf weed control?
So you're talking about, will clover be affected by broadleaf weed control? The answer is absolutely yes. So the clover we have in our yards, usually, so there are some native clovers. Usually we do not have native clovers in our yards. Usually the clovers that we have in our yards is low-growing white clover. And white clover is not native here. It's native to Europe. I have to be honest, since I was 7 years old, I remember clover in our yard. And honestly, even when I do apply 2,4-D, I try to avoid the clover. 2,4-D will absolutely kill clover. No two ways about it. So if you can avoid it, avoid it. When I use 2,4-D, I kind of target the areas which are really bad. And then, and bad, I mean high in dandelions or whatever, and then try and leave the clover part alone as much as I can.
Corn gluten, is that something that controls weed or is a fertilizer? And is that a good option to be organic?
Say that again.
Corn gluten, is that a good option?
Thank you. Thank you for raising, whoever raised that, thank you for raising that as something that I meant to talk about and did not. Corn gluten meal is a good option, but having said it's a good option, I want to explain. Corn gluten meal is applied very heavily. It's applied at a rate, concentration, of 20 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Here's the thing. When you use corn gluten meal to fertilize, it is a fertilizer, you use 20 pounds per 1,000 square feet, that is actually enough to fertilize and to control weeds. And when I say control weeds, it's not going to kill existing dandelion. Dandelion is a perennial weed. It's going to come back year after year, but it will stop seeds from germinating. It's known as a pre-emergence herbicide, so it stops weeds from germinating. Here's the bad news, or the good news, depending on how you look at it. When you do weed control by using synthetic things like 2,4-D and the compounds used to control crabgrass, you will control about 98 to 99% of the weeds easily. When you use corn gluten meal, the best you're going to control is 80%. Now, having said that, I think 80% is great because I like a diverse lawn. I think 80% is wonderful. But if you're one of those people who likes that, steroid pumped lawn, then it's not going to be satisfactory to you. But for people who like a somewhat diverse lawn, corn gluten meal is a wonderful option, and I honestly can't recommend it strongly enough because not only is it pre-emergence, not only is it a good fertilizer, but it's also incredibly safe. I mean, corn gluten meal is actually used as a filler in cat food. So I really believe in that compound. Now, there is also an organic spray that you can use for dandelion. It is, I believe Woodridge Farms is the seller, and it's for broadleaf weeds. What it is a chelated iron. What it does is grass can take a whole lot of iron. You can fertilize grass with a whole lot of iron, and it turns greener, but it doesn't get hurt. Whereas broadleaf weeds can only take so much iron before they die. It needs to be reapplied again and again and again, which is kind of a pain. But this chelated iron actually does work effectively for broadleaf weeds, and it's certainly safer for your animals than 2,4-D, although not completely safe. Not like corn gluten meal, which really is safe. Your chelated iron is kind of safe. Okay.
We've got another question. It's about trees in your yard. And how do you understand which trees would cause a root ball and mess up your plumbing or septic tank? What would be the trees to avoid, or where would be the resource?
Okay, well, that's really tough. You can look, there are various extension services that have put that out. Do a good Google search. But a couple that I know to have problems, willow trees. I mean, willows will just beeline for septic systems. Some of your maples will. But there are lists, and the extension services around you should have them. Let's see, you had mentioned the DC area. Virginia Tech is definitely going to have some good stuff, and Penn State is definitely going to have some good stuff. Maryland may or may not, but Penn State and Virginia Tech will definitely have some quality resources on that kind of thing.
Great. We've got one more question on deck, and the question is, with heavy rains that wash away our deep shade grass, before I reseed, should I aerate?
Okay, aeration is always a good idea, but if you have a slope, be careful with aeration, because it also is going to mean that more of your soil is going to wash away, and having more of your soil wash away is obviously going to be a bad thing. So I'm all about aeration. Just be careful that you're not setting yourself up to have a really big erosion event. So that's what I would say to that. If you are in a slope and you really, really want to aerate, this is a case where I actually would recommend using some of that rye, some of that perennial rye that I was talking about before. And the reason for that is that the perennial rye will establish really, really quickly. And normally we don't like that, but that's going to mean the perennial rye is actually going to hold that soil. So whereas typically I wouldn't recommend it, in this case, it's going to help you hold that soil while the other grasses get established. Okay. Are there any other questions?
Not at this time.
Not right now? Okay. If you do get some questions, let me know. But since I'm talking about slopes, I did want to go to another question that somebody had on the list that I thought was really, really interesting. And that's that, we have ground covers that can be used instead of grass. And some of these ground covers are really wonderful. Now, they're not going to be as good for playing football and with your kids or playing soccer with your kids. So obviously they're, somewhat limited in what we can do with them. But there are some really great ground covers that are worth considering. So let me give you just a few that I encourage you to look at. One is Pachysandra. I really, really like Pachysandra. It does take a few years to get established. It does well in the shade, but it'll cover the ground really nicely. Again, it's not one that you're going to want to step on because you'll break it and hurt it. But Pachysandra works great. Another one is Vinca, Periwinkle, okay, Vinca minor. Periwinkle can be a really, really wonderful ground cover. It can help hold the slope. It can help fill in an area underneath shrubbery, okay? I really, really like Periwinkle. Another one that you might consider, which won't be appropriate for every area, is English ivy. English ivy may be appropriate for you depending on what you want to do. You can plant it beside a building, for example. Okay? So those are some that I think that you should look at. Also had one question, or actually a couple of questions, on insect and mole control. I'll talk about moles and voles first. If you have moles or voles in your lawn, I know how tough they are to get rid of, and there are very few products out there that really, really work. The one that does work, and that I have no trouble at all recommending to you, are castor bean products. Now, when I say castor bean products, I'm actually talking about what you're going to find in the garden center. If you go to the garden center, you will actually find castor oil products there, and they are very repellent to moles and voles, and they can actually give you up to 6 months of control in good situations. So for moles, castor oil products from the garden center. Okay, now I was asked about grubs in the lawn. For grubs in the lawn, there are two schools. I know that you want to control them, and the question was, how do I control them? How can I be proactive? There aren't a whole lot of chemicals that you can use proactively. Those are mostly dangerous. There is one organic one that is not effective, but you can use it proactively. It's called milky spore disease. Milky spore disease only has a 25% kill rate, which is awful, but you can use it proactively. Once you have grubs in your lawn, then you can start to use some more aggressive stuff. But you really shouldn't use the aggressive stuff until you actually know that the insect's there. Most of this stuff is too dangerous to just spread around willy-nilly. But if you anticipate grubs, you don't have them bad enough to use the bad stuff yet, you can use milky spore disease. It's not a bad thing to apply. It's just not all that effective. So consider that. It's also asked about deer-resistant plants. Let me tell you two things about deer. Number one, they're very, very difficult to control. Number two, once they're there, the best thing to do is to scare them away. And what I've found to be most successful is something called Scarecrow. Scarecrow is actually a motion detector that's hooked to a hose, so that when the deer triggers it, it sprays them with water, and that scares them away, and then it shuts off. I think that that's the most effective way to control deer. In terms of deer-resistant plants, let me be honest with you. I have never known a plant to be fully deer-resistant. It's just whether the plant gets attacked at the beginning of the winter or the end of the winter. Deer resistance is, I don't know. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but it's rugged. It's rugged. I don't know an extension service that doesn't at least have a list of deer-resistant plants, though. So the extension service, once again, is going to be your best bet for that. All right. Any other questions come across?
I do have. I've got someone who's curious about how to grow grass when they have a dog.
How to do what now?
How to grow grass when you've got a dog who is spotting around in the grass.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. So you're talking about controlling dog spots. Well, controlling dog spots is difficult. Let me tell you what a dog spot is so that you understand. You may not realize this, but urine is incredibly nutrient rich. You've probably read things that girls' dogs are worse than boy dogs. You've probably heard things about changing pH. That's all BS. And by BS, I mean bad stuff. Don't think that I'm swearing or anything. It's all BS. What's actually happening is that when the dog pees, when the dog urinates, it's actually over-fertilizing the grass. And that's why if you look very carefully at dog spots, you don't have to do this, I've already done it for you. The center of the spot is dead, and that's because of the amount of salt in the urine. Then, after you get past that center, you have this incredible growth, and that's from the high nutrition. And then at the edges, it just kind of tapers out to, it's still very green, but not nearly as green as that spot right next to where the dog peed. The only way to control that is by constantly and consistently washing it through by watering it. That is really it. And it's because, again, it's because urine is such a wonderful fertilizer. I mean, if you could have your dog pee evenly across all of your grass, it would actually make an amazing fertilizer. And I know it sounds like a joke. That's not a joke. I'm actually very, very serious about that. It's part of the whole cycle of nutrients. Urine's a wonderful fertilizer. It's actually about as good as it gets. But the only way to really control it is by constantly watering it through. So I wish I could give you a better answer, but it is what it is. It is what it is.
Okay, it's magic in a bottle.
It
We have
is.
somebody who's curious about the cicadas coming next summer, and is it okay to transplant a tree this fall, knowing that something may happen to that tree next year?
That was on the list and I completely forgot. So I want to thank that person for reminding me and apologize for not getting to it right away. So I understand your concern about the 17-year cicadas. They certainly will be in the ground. And I understand why it would concern you for fall planting, because the danger would be that the cicadas will come and chew the tree roots. The truth is that unless you have an incredibly huge population, bigger than I've ever seen before, I doubt that the density of cicadas in your ground is enough to cause any major problems. I don't doubt that a couple of roots are going to be eaten, but I strongly doubt that it's going to be anything major. I have never seen or heard about anything like that. So I understand the question. It makes a lot of sense, but I would not worry. I strongly doubt that you'll lose anything beyond a few roots, which honestly, the plant is used to losing a few roots, so it'll be okay.
Okay, great. Our next question is, when is it okay to prune a dogwood?
When's it okay to prune a dogwood? That is a great question. Okay, so dogwoods get a lot of diseases. Dogwoods that you're probably talking about are native dogwoods. When in doubt, winter prune. Why do I say that? Because over the winter, diseases are not active. So when you prune a dogwood or any other plant that gets a lot of diseases, when you prune over the winter, you are pruning at a time when diseases aren't going to have a chance to get into the plant. So I strongly recommend a winter pruning. When I say winter pruning, I don't mean that you have to get out there in January. Usually we do our pruning at the very early winter or very late winter. So not at, out there in Chicago, -20. Don't prune at -20. Prune when the temperatures are in that 25-degree range. That's a nice temperature to prune. That's when I like to prune.
Okay, great. Our next question is, someone has a winter hardy variety of a banana plant, and she lives in Northern Virginia, and would like to know, can that plant be left out all winter, or does it need to be covered in any regard?
Wow. The crazy thing is I was actually just having this discussion with somebody online. Here in Charlotte, we are fine for bananas outdoors. They'll die back usually to the ground, but they'll come back next year. Up there in Northern Virginia, I have to be honest, I don't like their chances over the winter, so I would bring it in over the winter. I'm not saying it doesn't have a chance, and certainly if you're in a protected area, like you see this courtyard I'm in right here, this is a protected area, and in this area in Northern Virginia, I bet it would do fine. But if it's out and exposed at all, I don't think much of its chances, and I would bring it in.
The next question is how would someone prep their fig tree for the winter?
Okay, very, very dependent on where you live. There are fig trees that are hardy enough up in Chicago. And those ones that are up in Chicago, you can basically cut those back. The tops are going to burn right off. So you can knock the tops off right as we go into the winter. Having said that, here in Charlotte, the fig trees are going to be fine. We're at least partially stem hardy. So I would actually leave the fig trees out and wouldn't cut them back at all. And then at the end of the winter, I'd just cut off whatever had died on them. My parents actually live up in just outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They have a number of fig trees. They actually cover their fig trees over the winter, and most of their stem will actually live over the winter. So it very much depends on where you live.
Okay, our fig guy lives in Maryland. I just got a note from him.
Okay.
Our next one is how should I prune my crepe myrtle, and how far back should I go?
Okay. Crepe myrtle is notorious for being what's known as topped. In fact, we call it crepe murder. What being topped means is you basically take a chainsaw, vroom, vroom, and just go across like this, as if you're giving somebody a flat top. That is not the way to cut a crepe myrtle or any other plant. You may go back as far as you want to on a crepe myrtle. In fact, crepe myrtles can practically be cut back to the ground, and they're going to resprout. It sounds like you probably don't want to do that, but you can if you want to. For a tree like that, cutting away, say, 30% of the canopy is what's typical, and it's absolutely fine. Just be sure that instead, you know, when you do a topping like that, you're going to leave these partial branches. That's terrible. When you take out a branch, take it out from its origin. Yeah, so this guy. If this was a branch right here, it's actually not, it's a leaf, but if this were a branch right there, I'd take it off right here. So take it off at its origin. And then if you want to cut back 30% of the canopy or so, that's absolutely fine. If you do want to cut it to the ground, it's going to grow back. So, or usually, I shouldn't say it will. I should say, unless it's sick or something else is going on, 95% of the time they grow back.
I don't have any live questions right now, but I have a personal one when it comes to the fall care and planting. What kind of bulbs are great for planting in the South to have great flowers in the spring?
What kind of bulbs?
Yes, what bulbs would you recommend now in the South for a spring flower?
Well, there's a lot of wonderful ones. I myself am partial to tulips, but April, do you have a suggestion? I'm here with one of our gardeners, and do you have a suggestion?
I was just gonna say they see your face in the camera here, not on the screen.
No.
Sorry.
I personally love tulips, all different types. Let me tell you one plant, though, this is actually for fall blooms. This is actually for fall blooms. And it's amazing. And right before I did this show, I actually purposely went out to sniff it because I like it so much. Ginger lily. If you know ginger lily, you need to plant it. It'll go up through Virginia, and it is an amazing plant. So take a look at that. It's at least for today, it's my favorite plant. But tulips is always the direction I go. You know, the first plant that I ever bought, I bought from my mom, and it was a hyacinth. And if you don't like spring hyacinths, there's something wrong with you. So I'm all about the hyacinths and the grape hyacinths, but especially the hyacinths. Okay.
Okay, great. I love them as well. They smell great. The next question is can you divide a hosta in the fall?
Yes. Man, you give me these simple questions. Yeah, it doesn't take any time at all. You can divide a hosta in this fall. Nothing wrong with it. For us here in Charlotte, I wouldn't do it quite yet. I'd probably wait about a month or so before I divided.
I've got a tree question for you, and it's someone from Northern Illinois. And
Okay.
The question really is about oak trees. And what is your recommendation for a rule of thumb for how close you could plant an oak tree to a home?
Okay, that's a tough one. There are a lot of different types of oak trees, but I wouldn't plant an oak tree. Oak trees, generally speaking, are going to be huge trees, and even though it'll take them many, many years to reach size, they are still going to reach quite a size. I wouldn't put them any closer than 20 or 30 feet to my home. I would want a good distance between my house and the oak tree. They get big.
Okay. And he also wants to know, is there a size that is not possible to transplant? Like, when does an oak tree get too big that it can't move to another spot?
Okay. Oak trees are tough transplants. So I would say an oak tree that's taller than about 6 feet is actually going to be tough to transplant. Oaks are hard transplants. Birch is a hard transplant. Let me tell you this also. I start off this talk saying that fall is the best time to plant. For oaks and birch, actually, especially up north, they're a spring transplant. Transplanting in the fall, tough transplant. So for those trees, about 6 foot is the part at the time at which it just gets harder. They're just more difficult to transplant. However, something like a maple, a red maple, you can transplant a red maple when it's 20 feet if you have a big enough root ball on it. So maples tend to be easy. So it's very, very tree dependent. But an oak, and for an oak, beyond 6 feet, you're starting to get into so-so territory.
And then is that the same rule of thumb that winter should be the time that it's pruned?
Yes, yes. Always, when in doubt, winter is the time. That's actually especially true with oak. Oak has a few diseases that are very active in the spring and summer. So that's a bad time to prune them. In fact, I have an oak tree in my yard that I really need to prune. But I keep having to tell my wife I'm not pruning it now. I'm waiting till November when we go dormant, because if we don't, there's a few diseases that could get in there and cause some real problems. So hold off. Wait for the winter to prune, especially oaks, especially dogwoods. They both get a lot of diseases that can cause a lot of problems if you prune at the wrong time.
Gotcha. We have someone who has a lot of lilies that are taking over their plant bed. And the question is, can lilies be moved? And when should that be done?
Can lilies be moved?
Mm-hmm.
They certainly can. If you want them to survive, which I'm assuming you do, then now probably isn't quite the time to do it. You probably want to wait a month, depending on where you are. Now, if you're up in Illinois, now might be okay, but in Charlotte, I would wait just a little bit longer until things start to go dormant. You know, once again, you're waiting for that dormancy. You're waiting for the top to not want to grow so the bottom can really spread those roots. So that's what I'm waiting for right now. I'm seeing a lot of top growth and things as our season is ending. In fact, here in Charlotte, I kind of feel like we're not really even in the fall yet. Whereas I know up north, I know you guys are feeling some weather right now, but here we're really not yet.
Our next question is can you transfer a Princeton elm tree, and does it transfer well?
Can you transfer a Princeton elm and
does it transfer well? How tall can it be?
All right, so the Princeton elm is a true American elm, which is resistant to Dutch elm disease. And in fact, I got to work with them quite a bit when I was in Minnesota. I adore the Princeton elm. I mean, just adore it. The Princeton elm is always an easy transplant, which is likely to fare well, even if it's on the large side. It's ultimately going to be a large tree. And by large tree, shoot, it could reach 80 feet, no problem. It's going to do well. And it transplants easy, and I strongly recommend it, but it should not be right next to your house, because a large tree like that could drop a limb at some point in its life. But great tree, great choice.
Okay, great. And it looks like I have one last question that's in the queue, and the question is how can you make hydrangeas last longer?
How do you make hydrangeas last longer?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. I'm assuming that you mean make the flowers last longer.
I believe so.
Typically, flowers will last longer if you fertilize, and I know this is going to be counterintuitive, a little bit less. So believe it or not, fertilizing a little bit less is probably going to extend your season slightly for hydrangeas. But, you know, a lot of this is genetically imprinted, so don't expect any radical changes. You might be able to extend by a week or two, but that's really all you're gonna do. Okay.
Great. And it looks like that is the last question we have. Dr. Gilman, thank you so much for your time today and for answering all of our questions. I think you did a great job getting all of those points that we sent over to you. We really appreciate the time you spent with everyone today.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Again, this is the UNC Charlotte Botanical Gardens in Charlotte, North Carolina. If any of you are ever driving through, we'd love to see you. If you have any questions that I didn't answer today, or if you felt my answer was either off or you have further questions, I hope that you'll go ahead and post my email address. I had a few people from last time contact me, and that was wonderful. I am very happy to answer questions. I love talking with people, and we love for people to visit our botanical gardens and check out all the neat stuff we have. Options that could replace turf grass. You'll want to see those. So thanks, guys, and I look forward to talking to you later.
Thanks to everyone. You can view this session along with all of our others at beconet.com/flourish. Hope you all have a great day. Thanks so much.